Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. We are so thankful to be back. We had quite a busy 2 weeks, had a funeral to go to, and took that opportunity to see both of our parents, both of our mothers. So we've been gone for a while, but we are back in studio and very, very happy to be here. Today, I am going to teach on, Stephen, hand me that document right there. Thank you. Today, I'm going to teach about spiritually spoken worship again, and this is the 9th location in Romans that Stephen has identified where Paul is actually referencing spiritually spoken worship. Now remember, Paul is writing to the Jews and to the Gentiles, but he's first writing to the Jews, so he's writing in their context. He's writing in language that they understand. And then he's also including the Gentiles. But in order for you to understand where this 9th reference to spiritually spoken worship, how this is spiritually spoken worship, is you have to look at the foundation beginning in Romans 1:1, and Paul keeps building on this. So there are 41 different places where Paul is referencing spiritually spoken worship in the book of Romans. We're going to go through all of those, but it's really important that you look back at them and also understand that when I get up and I talk for 10 minutes about a single passage, that is not nearly enough time to give you the full depth of everything that undergirds and supports this reference to spiritually spoken worship. So this is going to be something that you look at and it's going to be different than what you've understood this passage to mean before. But if you hold everything in context, all of the pieces together, it knits together perfectly and it answers so many questions that even scholars have had where they say, we don't really know what this means, but it could mean this. But when you plug spiritually spoken worship into those meanings, it really becomes clear. In order to get that, though, you have to understand that there are two realms of sanctification. I probably am saying that wrong, Stephen, but you have got, when God gives you faith to believe, Legacy Bible Church calls that justification. And that is through faith that God has given you. Then, through that faith, in the obedience from that faith that you have received, then you operate from that faith into spiritually spoken worship. That's where you die to yourself, where you're circumcised in the heart. You are no longer an active participant because you have set your heart and your mind aside and you are allowing the Father to speak through you in unknowable groanings, in spiritually spoken worship. That's the dying to self. But we're going to get into this. This is the 9th one, and it's in Romans 4:12. And first, before we do that, though, we're going to read 4:11. Stephen will put that up on the slide. And I am reading from Stavros, the Wooden Bible. Would you look at that? So excited that he's got this printed. It's not totally finished, but it will be. So Romans 4:11. And this is just the bottom part of it. I'm going to read from 11. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness through the faith, which is from God, which was during the uncircumcision. So Abraham received faith from God before he was circumcised. Through the faith, which was during the uncircumcision, for him to be a father of all those believing through uncircumcision, for faith to be reckoned also to them as righteousness. So we're going to get into that in just a bit, but now I'm going to go on to 12. If you'll notice on 11, there's a comma. Then we go into 12. Go ahead, Stephen. And it continues. So it's very unusual to break two passages in mid-sentence, but it's important because the heading on the other one is those believing through uncircumcision. And this new passage is those walking orderly. These are two distinct separate thoughts. They are separated by this comma. One is through the faith from God. The other one is from the faith. So up to 11, we're talking about through the faith. Through the faith is from God. And now 12 is from that faith we have received from God. What do we do going forward? So 12 reads, and the father of circumcision, not only to those from the circumcision, but also to those walking orderly in the footsteps of the during uncircumcision faith of our father Abraham. Now I can read on that further, but I'm going to put those slides up for you at the end of the lesson, and I just want to talk a little bit about what those mean. So in 11, we are talking about, you can take that off, honey. There you go.
Turn them both off.
Yeah, turn them both off. Thanks. In 11, remember, we're talking about Abraham, who received faith before he was circumcised. And from that faith, he was circumcised. Now in 12, we're talking about a circumcision of the heart, walking from faith into spiritually spoken worship. That's the circumcision of the heart. But before that, we had the through faith. God gave us faith to believe, just like he gave Abraham faith to believe. And Abraham was circumcised in the flesh from his faith. Well, now we've received faith to believe. And from that faith to believe, we are circumcised in our heart to walk orderly in the uncircumcision of Abraham. That is spiritually spoken worship. I know it might be hard to wrap your mind around that, but all of it is building. And if you will, at the end of this lesson, take a screenshot of these translations from Stavros the Wooden Bible, and I've also given you Romans 3 with Romans 3:31, because that's a referring back into that. So if you go to 2 weeks ago to Romans 3:26, and then these 3 slides, and ponder that and look at that in your test in the translation that you're reading, but place spiritually spoken worship into those translations where I have it bolded and see how much sense that makes. Anyway, I thank you for joining us. Thank you for sticking with me as I struggle through teaching something that is so difficult but is so important. Thank you for joining us. Stephen will continue his teaching on the Good Shepherd.
All right. Well, welcome, Legacy Bible Church. We, as Robin said, we are glad to be back with you. And by the way, we are broadcasting from my library this morning. So you see part of my library behind me there. And this is kind of a new venue for us. So we may do this more in the future, but just so you know where we are broadcasting from here this morning. And I want to say one thing about Romans 4:12, that when you don't view Paul's argumentation through the lens of God's two-dimensional plan of salvation, particularly, which is Paul's main focus, the end purpose of God's salvation plan, it's very difficult to make sense out of what he's writing. People the smartest theologians in the history of the church have argued forever, what does Paul mean? Well, he could mean this, he could mean that. One of the interesting things that in the verse that Robin spoke on today, 4:12, there is an article in there that refers to the second grouping of people, where Abraham is the father of circumcision, not only of those from the circumcision, but also those walking orderly. And in that second part, those walking orderly, Paul uses an article, just it's a plural dative article that basically just means the, and it's inferring, theologians, grammarians, they have known that it's referring to a second group of people. And so you have that first group, those from the circumcision, that's referring to the Israelites according to the flesh, circumcision according to the flesh. And then he says, and also those walking orderly in the I think before circumcision faith. And that article there has been confusing to church leaders and theologians forever, because they don't know how to make sense out of the fact that Paul's talking about two groups of people there. They know that that second article infers a second grouping of people, but they just don't know how to make sense out of it. So that one of I guess if there is a most reputable, most revered commentary on Romans in the last 50 years, it would probably be the commentary by C.E.B. Cranfield. He was a British Christian scholar, and he wrote a commentary on Romans, which most modern theologians, academic theologians, would say that this commentary is probably the best written in the last half century. And here's what Cranfield says about that article in Romans 4:12. It just I was astounded when I saw it. But he raised the possibility that if it's original, and he says because there are no variants, all of the ancient manuscripts reflect this article, so you can't blame it on a scribal error. He speculated, well, Paul probably just made a mistake. That's how he accounts for the article. Church, when you read the New Testament authors and you don't understand the argument they're making, at least be humble enough to say, well, we probably don't know what Paul means here. That, I think, would be the appropriate answer. But to go the length that Cranfield did, which I have a lot of respect for Cranfield. I've studied his work. I've learned a lot from his work. But when he said that Paul probably made a mistake in writing that article, that crossed over a line that we should never cross over. And I was astounded when I read that. I don't think I've read that in any other work, any other place. But so confusing and so unusual is that article in Romans 4:12 that infers a second grouping of people. Instead of explaining the first grouping, it infers a second grouping. So confusing is that was all C.E.B. Cranfield knew to do with it. He didn't want to say, I don't know what it means. So he said Paul probably made a mistake. He would have been much better off to say, I just don't know why Paul put that that article there. I don't know why Paul's inferring a second grouping of people. That would have been a much better thing to do. So we teach at Legacy Bible Church, as Robin so ably demonstrated here today, that the New Testament, from beginning to end, in fact, the Old Testament is all pointing toward God's two-dimensional plan of salvation. The near purpose through the faith, which is from Jesus Christ. It's the realm of positional forensic justification. And then what out of that's a sovereign work of God. Out of that, God desires, expects, and yes, demands, he commands obedience. What Paul called in the book of Romans, he literally bookends Romans, he calls the obedience from faith. And that is the realm of functional because it's something you do, right? Forensic justification is positional. You don't have to do anything. God gives faith, and you then occupy the position of a child of God. It's positional forensic justification. It's tantamount to a legal pronouncement, although it's not just legal, it's efficacious. He gives faith to believe. That's like he plants the DNA of his son Jesus into your heart, and he thereafter, forever, you are a child of God. But we call that in theological terms, theological circles, forensic justification. And then it's out of that God commands obedience, what Paul called the obedience from faith. That's the end purpose of God's salvation plan. What we call Legacy Bible Church functional, because you have to do something. You're in the realm of, you are worshiping God. You are speaking forth the Rhema word of Christ. That's the end purpose of God's salvation plan. That, in fact, is the realm of salvation. The near purpose is redemption. You don't enter into the salvation of God until you would die to self. You enter into that realm of union, spiritual union with Jesus Christ. That is the realm of God's salvation. But the only people that have access to the realm of God's salvation are those whom God sovereignly redeems through the faith. So God redeems through the faith, and then we operate in the obedience from faith into spiritually spoken worship. A little bit of review, a little bit of background. We do that from time to time at Legacy Bible Church, especially for those of you that are new, but review is so important to reinforce these important things as you're grabbing nuggets from our weekly teachings. We want you to always have in view the core thesis, if you will, of the New Testament. Therefore, it's the core thesis of our teaching at Legacy Bible Church. We don't make anything up at Legacy Bible Church. We're a ministry of restoring to the church the full meaning that the New Testament authors had when they wrote their documents. And so that little bit of history on the verse that Robin taught on today, Romans 4:12, with that Greek article tois. It's the dative, plural, masculine article that infers a second group of people. Has been so grossly misunderstood without the full understanding of God's salvation plan. But when you understand the fullness of God's two-dimensional plan of salvation, it fits perfectly into every single one of these otherwise difficult to understand passages in the New Testament. It fits everywhere, and it fits like a glove. Why? Why is that? It's because that's what the New Testament authors were writing about. That's why it fits everywhere. It's not an accident. They were writing about God's two-dimensional plan of salvation with an emphasis on the end purpose of God's salvation plan. So it's no surprise and no accident that that hermeneutic fits everywhere perfectly. And all those passages that have been so difficult to understand suddenly come to life through this theological lens of God's two-dimensional plan of salvation. And that phenomenon is no less so in the fourth gospel that we've been teaching on for quite some time now. This is week number 5 that I'm in the first half of chapter 10 of the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. That's the passage on the Good Shepherd. And this is week 5, and this is going to be the final week. We're going to wrap it up. There's been so much that have been packed into the first 4 weeks. It'd be difficult to even give a quick review of that. And I don't want to take up our time here by doing that, but I'd encourage you that if you haven't listened to the first 4 parts, please go back and listen to them. You can go onto our website at lbcdfw.org. That stands for Legacy Bible Church Dallas Fort Worth.org. Our website is lbcdfw.org. You can go up to the top and hit the sermons button, and it'll bring up our entire library of sermons that we've done for going on 3 years now. In fact, we're now into the 3rd year of the teachings that we have in our online library. So you can go there, click on the sermons button, and go back and listen to the first 4 parts of the Good Shepherd. They're so pregnant and packed with meaning, and it would be difficult to give a summarized explanation in just 1 or 2 minutes of everything that I've gone over in the first 4 weeks. And it's going to be difficult as it is here for me to wrap up. I have a couple of points that I want to make as we wrap up into the final passage on this pericope on the Good Shepherd, and good being kalos, Good Shepherd, not agathos, Good Shepherd. And if you've listened in the previous weeks, you know why Jesus is using kalos, good. I'll review that one briefly because it's so important to what we're going to be talking about today. Kalos, good, instead of agathos, good. There are two words in the New Testament for good, kalos and agathos. They have been translated in English translations as just good. So if you read through your English translation, you will not know if the author is using kalos or agathos. All you're going to know is the English gloss good, and you're not going to be able to differentiate. Well, one of the things I do in Stauros, the Wooden Bible, is I do differentiate between kalos good and agathos good, so that when you're reading through Stauros, the Wooden Bible, and you come on the word good, you are going to know if it's kalos or agathos. Very important to the context of the authors. Essentially, in a nutshell, just the quick definition, agathos good infers the intrinsic goodness of God. God is agathos good, irregardless of anything. It doesn't matter about human opinions or speculations. God is just agathos good. It's part of his divine nature, and that's just the way it is. So the New Testament authors reserve agathos good always in the context of the pure, unadulterated, intrinsic, innate goodness of God. Kalos good, on the other hand, is used in the context of when subjectivity is involved. So kalos good, often used in the New Testament in the context of human opinion, where, we can, as human beings, we're kind of fickle. We can think something is good one day, and the next day we can think that it's not so good. And so kalos good is a subjective form of good based on opinions and judgments. It may be good, it may not be good, it may vary from one person to the next, and that's where kalos good is used. And so here, Jesus, the fourth evangelist, has Jesus using kalos good. Jesus says, I am the kalos good shepherd. And that should come as a surprise that Jesus is talking about himself. And you would think he'd be using, right, the intrinsic goodness of God, the word kalos good. But he doesn't. He uses I get these mixed up as I'm talking here because I'm getting ahead of myself in my mind. You would think that he would use agathos good, the intrinsic goodness of God, but he doesn't. He uses kalos good, that subjective good. And the reason he does is this, because the shepherd is the one who lays down his soul, lays down his life for the sheep. And Jesus is about to go to the cross where he's going to bear the sins of the world. And so Jesus uses kalos good here because it's in a worldly context where he becomes sin for the sake of men and women. He's no longer in the agathos good of God. And the Apostle Paul, I think it's in the book of Galatians, says that Jesus Christ became sin for the world, in order that we might become those who believe into Jesus, in order that we might become the righteousness of God. So Jesus becomes sin in order that we might, out of the obedience from faith, become the righteousness of God. And so that is the reason that Jesus is using kalos good here and not agathos good, because he's talking about this phenomenon, this realm of obedience, right? Jesus had to be obedient to the Father. The Father sent him into the world for the very purpose to go to the cross. And so Jesus is operating out of obedience to lay down his life and become sin for the sake of the world. Kalos good. And as we'll see here in the passage we're going to talk about today, Jesus is representing here in this pericope on the Good Shepherd not only the fact that he's the first to die for the sake of humanity, but that he is our example to follow him. He's our example in laying down his soul and going to the cross. Jesus is our example, just like he says in chapter 13, after the washing of his disciples' feet. He says, I have given you an example, just as I have done for you, so also you do. So also you wash your feet for the sake of, on behalf of one another. And so this passage here in the Good Shepherd, Jesus is representing his example that he expects, that he is doing, that he is presenting, that his followers, his disciples, would follow him and follow the example for which he was the first. He was the first good shepherd to lay down his life, and he wants his disciples to become good shepherds, laying down their life according to the obedience from faith. This is the new covenant salvation plan of God. This is what Jesus is representing here in the pericope on the Good Shepherd. And also important, do not lose sight of the fact that Jesus is not speaking directly to his disciples in this passage. You remember who he's speaking to? He's speaking to the Pharisees. Jesus, in this passage on the Good Shepherd, is speaking to the Pharisees, who are the teachers of Israel. So I'm already beginning to review some of what I've taught in the past, and that's kind of hard not to do. But very important, you don't lose sight of the fact that as Jesus is teaching this passage, he is speaking to the Pharisees, who are the presumptuous, the teachers of Israel. And I say presumed or presumptuous because the law of Moses, Torah, has been corrupted. They teach a corrupted version of the law of Moses. Moses was always intended to shine a light on sin, and through the direct intervention of the angels of Satan, the law of Moses, the law that was given to Moses, was flipped upside down, and the Israelites, according to the teaching of the Pharisees, teach that we can do the law, and in doing the law, we attain to the righteousness of God. So rather than allowing the law to shine a light on their sin to where they say, we can't meet that standard, we're not able to attain to the righteousness of God through our own efforts in the flesh, trying to do the law, we can't do it. That was what Moses was intended for. Instead, they flipped it upside down and said, well, God gave the law, so we must be able to do the law. And in doing the law, in keeping the law, we attain to the righteousness of God. That's self-righteousness. That is a deception. It's wrong. And in God's eyes, it is entirely corrupt and entirely evil. And that's what the Pharisees, as the presumed teachers of Israel, were teaching the Jews, the Israelites. And so this is the audience of Jesus. This is who Jesus is teaching in this pericope on the Good Shepherd. Okay, a little bit of review there. That's not bad. Let's pick up right at verse 11. Robin, if you can go to the passage says, Jesus is the Good Shepherd, verse 11. Huh? 11?
1 through, oh, I've sent.
Verse 11.
Got it.
Jesus says, I am the Kalos Good Shepherd. The Kalos Good Shepherd lays down his soul on behalf of the sheep. The sheep are all those whom God has redeemed, are the sheep. The hired servant, and so not being a shepherd, notice a shepherd, not the shepherd, infers that the realm of being a shepherd is beyond just Jesus. That's what Jesus' whole point here is, to point beyond himself into the age of the new covenant, when his disciples, following him and following his example, become the shepherd. The hired servant, and so not being a shepherd, for whom the sheep are not his own, beholds the wolf coming. Remember the Pharisees, that's who Jesus is talking about. And yes, you can infer here, Jesus, with this metaphor, has just called the Pharisees wolves. That's his meaning here. Beholds the wolf coming. And the hired servant leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf ravages them and scatters them. Because he is a hired servant and he is not concerned about the sheep. I taught about that in great detail in part 4 that I taught on 2 weeks ago, Robin, that I taught on 2 weeks ago.
Great.
So if you want to go hear much more about this passage, in particular, the hired servant and the one that, and why he flees, etc., go listen to part 4. Verse 14, Jesus says, I am the kalos good shepherd, and I know familiarly the my sheep. And the my sheep know me familiarly. So this is the passage that leads into the final passage that I want to cover today. And I don't think it's going to take long to cover the final passage, but the context coming into the final passage is this differentiation, this distinction between the sheep, which is all spirit regenerated believers are sheep. If you have received faith to believe, you are one of the sheep. And that is a sovereign work of God. He gives faith. He plants the faith which is from Jesus Christ into the heart of a human being. And that makes you a DNA spirit regenerated child of God. You are a new creation. That's what the sheep are. Then out of the sheep, there are two realms of presumed teacher, if you will. There's the hired servant that is presuming to teach the spirit regenerated children of God. And then there is the good shepherd. And there are two subsets there that Jesus is presenting, that he is representing. And he is saying that the hired hand is not concerned for the sheep because the sheep are not his own. How can he say that? You know that from the previous teachings, the realm of evangelism is in this end purpose of God's salvation plan, right? In the first passage where he talks about the shepherd calls out to the sheep by name. And that's when you are in the realm of the end purpose of God's salvation plan, speaking forth in tongues, speaking the rhema of Christ. Those unknowable utterances are going out, going forth into the world, and they have assignments on them. They have names on them to where they are evangelizing the lost, men and women who become spirit regenerated children of God. That's the good shepherd calling out to the sheep by name, right? And you remember from the previous teachings in that first passage, there are two verbs there, exago and ekbalo, that refer to the redeemed man or woman being led out and driven out of the house of the strong man, the ruler of this world, and becoming part of the household of God. So that's the realm of the good shepherd doing true evangelism. That's how men and women are redeemed out of the world. It's a sovereign work of God through the organs of speech of the disciples of Jesus Christ, who will participate with God in the end purpose of his salvation plan. So that's why you can say here that the hired servant is not concerned for the sheep because the sheep are not his own. The difference being the good shepherd is the one who went into that spiritual union with Jesus Christ and became the voice, the mouthpiece, calling out to the sheep by name. And out of that, they are birthed into the kingdom of God. So the shepherd can say that the new children of God, those who are redeemed out of the house of this world and into the house of God, the shepherd can call them his own, because it was in that spiritual union with Jesus Christ, right? The bride and the groom, the marriage is consummated. We're at the table of the Lord, speaking forth the rhema of Christ, and out of that, men and women have the DNA of Jesus Christ planted into their heart by the sower, the Holy Spirit. They become the redeemed children of God. So the shepherd can say that those sheep are his own. He participated in their birthing, becoming new creations, being driven out of the house of the ruler of this world and into the house of God. The shepherd can call the sheep his own. The hired servant can't do that. The hired servant has not participated in that realm of evangelism. The hired servant is standing in front of the sheep, presuming to teach, but he doesn't really know, nor does he truly care. And Jesus says here why he doesn't truly care. Why? Because they're not his own. The hired servant has not participated in true evangelism of leading out and driving out the lost from the house of the ruler of this world into the house of God. The hired servant has not participated in the end purpose of God's salvation plan. And here's the risk. Here is the problem with that. Jesus talks about it in this passage. The hired servant who doesn't care about the sheep is very subject to the coming of the wolf, and wolves will come, church. The fourth evangelist calls them in his first epistle the Antichrist. This is the wolf is the Antichrist. The wolf is the one that's going to come and teach about the faith contrary to the full salvation plan of God. And just like Paul said in Galatians chapter 5, that if you are trying to keep attain to the righteousness of God through works of the flesh, which is according to the customs of Moses, Paul said, you are far away from Christ. So the wolf, who Jesus is essentially calling these Pharisees, the wolf is the same realm of teacher that the fourth evangelist who is writing this pericope would refer to in his first epistle as the Antichrist. These are teachers. They're bringing teachers that are contrary to the gospel of Christ, that Paul called this contrary gospel, that Paul called the heteros euangelion. Galatians 1:6, he called it the heteros, the other good message, the heteros euangelion. Compared to what? Compared to Galatians 1:7, the good message of Christ, the euangelion of Christ. That's the euangelion of Christ is a direct reference to the end purpose of God's salvation plan. The good message of Christ is those unknowable utterances. That's the good message of Christ. So these are all the things that are wrapped up and swirling and going on in this pericope here that leads into the final one. So the wolf is a teacher who is going to teach diametrically opposed to the end purpose of God. The wolf is going to teach, and by the way, a teaching diametrically opposed to the full gospel, the end purpose of the salvation plan of God, is always going to be a realm of self-righteousness. But one thing Satan wants you to do is to think that you can do things in the flesh by your strength with your mind that God's going to look down on and say, oh, that's so righteous. What you're doing is so righteous. That is directly from the serpent. That is directly from Satan. We are sin infected, and we have no ability in our strength, with our wits, with our mind, with our sin infected mind, to do anything that God is going to look down on and say, oh, that's righteousness. That's tantamount. That is on par with my righteousness. That's not going to happen. But the one thing Satan wants to do, it's always been this way, all the way back to the first man and the first woman in the Garden of Eden. The serpent, Satan, his servants want human beings to think they don't need God for righteousness. Satan will always promote a doctrine and a tradition that teaches men and women that they can do things by their own strength, by their own intelligence, that attain to the righteousness of God. Why? Because if Satan can convince a man or a woman of that they can attain to the righteousness of God themselves, then Satan knows that they are separated from God. He has separated them from God. And so the theme, the modus operandi of Satan, of the evil one, of doctrines of demons, of traditions of men, is always, church, I want this to become part of the imprint of your psychology. It's self-righteousness. Anything that promotes the idea of attaining to the righteousness of God, or attaining to God's approval out of the efforts of our flesh and the efforts of our intellect, which is all sin infected, anything that promotes that idea or concept is from the evil one, is from Satan, and will only serve to separate you from God. To do the very thing it presumes to do is going to have the opposite in the kingdom of God. In God's economy, it's going to have the opposite effect. Striving after the righteousness of God by our efforts, our intellect, is always and only going to serve to separate you from God. Self-righteousness will never bring intimacy and closeness and relationship with God. Never, never, never. But that's always what Satan is going to try to deceive you into. That's why Jesus says so often, do not be deceived. Don't be deceived. Don't be deceived, right? He says this over and over again in the Gospels. How are you deceived? You're deceived always and only if you think you can do anything by your own effort and your own wits that's going to attain to the righteousness of God. That's deception. That's the deception of the evil one. That's what the Pharisees were doing. That's the type of teaching they were feeding to the Jews. That's what Jesus is pointing to here in this passage when he says, the wolf is going to come. The wolf is going to come, and the hired servant is going to flee from him. The hired servant who will not enter into the end purpose of God's salvation plan is not being edified by the Lord himself and strengthened by the Lord. The hired servant is going to see this wolf coming who teaches self-righteousness, and he's going to step aside. And he's going to allow this wolf, he's going to revere him and allow the wolf to come in and become the teacher. So don't forget here the literary agenda of the fourth evangelist. He's writing late in the first century. Israel, or Jerusalem, was destroyed some 2 decades earlier. The temple structure, the whole structure that Jesus is operating in here with the Pharisees, doesn't even exist anymore. The fourth evangelist's literary agenda is pointed to Rome. And the presbyters, the leaders, the elders of the church at Rome, who have inherited the mantle of the Judaized Christianity, the mantle of this quasi-Pharisaic teaching that is being promoted since the earliest years of the church, what Paul called the heteros euangelion, the other euangelion, that would not let go of Moses, in terms of the deceived Pharisaic perception of Moses. They wouldn't let go of the idea that we can attain to, in fact, are expected to attain to the righteousness of God by keeping the law. That's the other euangelion. That's the heteros euangelion. That's what the wolves want to promote. When the wolves show up at the door and have the doctrine of self-righteousness, traditions of men to support self-righteousness, the hired servant steps aside, moves out of the way, and allows the wolf to become the teacher of the sheep. The fourth evangelist is pointing at the elders in Rome. He's writing late in the first century. They are his typological targets. He's writing accurately about the history, the biological history of Jesus Christ, but he has a secondary literary agenda to point to the proto-Orthodox tradition that's being championed at Rome. So when he talks about wolves, yes, he is speaking, Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees, but the literary agenda of the fourth evangelist is to point to the presbyters of the proto-Orthodox religion at Rome that is persecuting, coming against the full gospel, particularly as represented by the churches in Asia, where the fourth evangelist, John, is writing from, right? He was the bishop, if you will, of the church at Ephesus in Asia late in the first century. And Asia remained through the second century the stronghold. The churches of Asia remained the stronghold of the full gospel, the euangelion of Christ, as the proto-Orthodox tradition that was championed at Rome is spread, hegemonically spread throughout the Roman Empire, until finally it came against the churches in Asia. And by the end of the fourth century, the full gospel had all but disappeared from the face of the church. But in the first century, this is what the fourth evangelist is pointing to. So I want you to have all of this concept here in this passage when you're reading about the hired servant and the wolf that's going to come in, and the hired servant steps aside because he has no concern for the sheep. Why? Because he's not a shepherd. And who is the wolf? The wolf is the Pharisaic teacher that is going to supplant the full gospel, the end purpose of God's salvation plan, which is dying to self and entering into the righteousness of God. That's all going to be supplanted with some form of self-righteousness. And anything that supplants the full gospel is going to be a doctrine of demons, a tradition of men that promotes self-righteousness. This is Jesus' entire concern here. This is what he is representing here. This is this image of the wolf that's going to come into the picture. This is what Jesus is thinking about and talking about and pointing at. He's essentially calling the Pharisees wolves, the people of Israel, and this new fledgling Christian community that's going to begin to evolve and develop, that the wolves are going to immediately come against and supplant righteousness in Jesus Christ with self-righteousness. You've heard in a couple of recent chat times with Sarah, where we talked about the tithe. And we titled those two segments and the tithe as the tithe, a roadblock to heaven. The tithe, a roadblock to heaven, because in much of the church where the tithe is taught as a compulsory requirement, the tithe in that context is a form of self-righteousness. That I might presume that I can tithe 10% of my earnings, and God is going to be so happy with me that his favor is going to come onto me because I am tithing 10% of my income. And that is nothing. That type of teaching is the teaching of wolves. And that type of practice of tithing, thinking that God is happy with me because I tithe, is a form of self-righteousness. So I just want to bring this whole context here of the Good Shepherd and this idea of the wolves and the idea of promoting self-righteousness. I want to bring it right up into our modern church here in the 21st century. That much of the church promotes a list of to-do things in order to be a good Christian so that God will be happy with you. That is the teaching of wolves, church. If you want to bring Jesus' concept here, his metaphor of wolf, right up into the 21st century, I want you to think in terms of your church tradition. Anything that the church would have you do and claim that if you will do this, you will attain to the righteousness of God. You will have the favor of God upon you because he's so happy with you. That is a teaching of wolves. The only true teaching that will attain to the righteousness of God, that will attain into the favor of God, so much so that God repays you every single time you will enter into, is the end purpose of God's salvation plan according to the obedience from faith, entering into that realm of union with Jesus Christ, spiritually spoken worship, speaking forth the rhema of Christ. That is the only means, the only way to attain into the righteousness of God and to attain to the favor of God every single time you will do that. If you will do that, which requires that you die and you get out of the way and allow God to use your flesh, every single time you will do that, what the fourth evangelist calls, by the way, doing the truth. When you're speaking the rhema of Christ, he says you are doing the truth. When you will do that, the favor of God will be upon you because you will receive a payback edification out of that every time you do. So I will call that my review of the passage on Jesus as the Good Shepherd, and I want to go into the last passage. So Robin, if you'll bring up verse 15. We call this laying down the soul. There's such an important concept. Keep in mind that Jesus is doing this with an eye toward this age of the new covenant. He's not just talking about what he's going to do on the cross and it's done one time and that's it. And all we can do is reflect back on it. No, no, no. He is doing this to teach, to prepare his disciples in this looming age of the new covenant that he's going to usher in through the cross and the empty grave. That's why he would say in chapter 13 to that, he said, what I do, I am an example. Follow my lead. Do what I'm doing. So we don't have to die on a cross, but he does expect us to die, as Paul would call it, in the likeness of his death. That's the dying to self according to the obedience from faith. So this is what we're going to talk about in the final passage here of the Good Shepherd, verse 15. Just as the Father knows me familiarly, and I know the Father familiarly. I talked about that in the teaching last week. If you want to know, what does that mean, knowing familiarly? Go back and listen to the teaching last week. I talk about that in great detail. Just as the Father knows me familiarly, and I know the Father familiarly, also I lay down my soul on behalf of the sheep. Now, here's what Jesus says that I really want to land on with this 5-part series here on the Good Shepherd. Verse 16. And I have other sheep, which are not from this fold. What's this fold? It's the sheep he referred to in verse 15. who he lays down his soul for. I have other sheep which are not from this fold. And so it is necessary for me to bring those sheep, and then they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock, having one shepherd. On account of this, my Father agape loves me. On account of what? On account of Jesus lays down his soul, the Father agape loves him. Keep in mind, Jesus is presenting this as an example for his disciples during the age of the new covenant. In other words, we are called to lay down our soul, to die to self. And it's out of that the Father, remember the word, where are you going to get the favor of the Father? Where will the Father agape love you? When you lay down your soul for the sheep, when you will die to self according to the obedience from faith, the Father will agape love you. That is the realm of God's favor. And by the way, agape love is always used in the context of God's creative work. When you see the term agape love, which is different than philo love, phileo love, that's a different realm, a different meaning than agape love. When you see agape love, I want you to think every time God is creating. God is doing something. God doesn't just agape love up in heaven with a warm, fuzzy feeling in his heart. He may have that, but the context for agape love always infers God is doing something. And when God is doing something, he's creating, church. When God does, he creates. For instance, when God is judging the ruler of this world in this current age of the new covenant, he's judging the ruler of this world through his creation of the children of God, who he plucks out of the house of this world and brings into his house. That's God's agape love working. When God is agape loving, he's doing something. He is doing something creative. And in evangelism, he's creating the children of God. And when God agape loves the shepherd who will lay down his life, who will enter into the end purpose of God's salvation plan through the obedience from faith, God's agape love, creative working, is working through us, right? That rhema goes out into the world, and then part of that comes back to us and becomes our own. That's the payback. It's a creative work. Our chaotic, sin-infected mind is reordered. Our faith is strengthened. That's all the creative working of God. So when Jesus talks about the Father agape loving him as the shepherd who would lay down his life, transfer that into the realm of the new covenant, this present age of the new covenant, that we can say the same thing. When I lay down my life out of the obedience from faith on behalf of the children of God, as Jesus said, love one another. Just as I have loved you, so also you love one another. It's the commandment that stands side by side with the commandment to love God with all of your being, all of your heart, all of your mind, all of your soul, all of your strength. You do that when you lay yourself down. You lay yourself down, your soul down, and you allow God to indwell your flesh and to use you as an instrument of righteousness. Only then are you loving God with your entire being. You have sacrificed everything you are, everything you have, so that God can use you as his instrument to bring his righteousness into the world. And that's when we can say, just like Jesus does in this final passage, that I lay down myself for the sheep, and the Father agape loves me because of that. He is working through me with his agape love, and he is then working in me with his agape love. I want you to make that transference, that correlation from what Jesus is saying about himself here, because this is what Jesus is pointing toward. Verse 17, on account of this, what? Laying down my life for the sheep. On account of laying down my life for the sheep, my Father agape loves me, because I lay down my soul. And listen to this, church. This is the last part of verse 17. I lay down my soul so that I may take it back. I want you to see the punctiliar nature here of this end purpose of God's salvation plan. Jesus, through the words written by the fourth evangelist, is making as explicit can be that this end purpose of God's salvation plan is punctiliar. It has a beginning and the end. I lay down my soul when I choose. God leaves it up to us when we will lay down our soul. He knows what we're going to do and when we do it. God knows the beginning from the end. And every time we will do it, it was a part of his plan before the foundation of the world. We're not inventing or creating anything here by exercising our free will to lay down our soul. God knew it before the beginning of the world. He not only knew it, it was his plan that you would do it. He knew it before you did it. That's the mystery of God, church. God doesn't negate the free will of man to operate in obedience to him. He knows about it before the foundation of the world. All those who are going to be obedient to him, and every time they would be obedient to him. Jesus calls it in Acts 1:7, the times and the seasons when the kingdom of God is going to come. Go read it in Acts chapter 1, right there in the beginning, when the disciples say, Jesus says, go tarry in Jerusalem. And they say, is this when the kingdom of God's going to come? And Jesus said, that's not for us to know. Only the Father knows the times and the seasons when the kingdom of God is going to come. And he knows before the foundation of the world. He designed it that way. So every time I lay down my soul for the sheep, knowing that the Father loves me because I do that. He's going to love through me, and he's going to love in me because I lay down my life for the sheep. I'm not doing anything that he didn't know or plan in advance before the foundation of the world. This is God's salvation plan playing out, working out, church. So verse 17, on account of this, my Father agape loves me because I lay down my soul so that I may take it back. It's punctiliar. It's repetitive. Just like the Lord's Supper is repetitive. Just like you can consummate the marriage as the bride of Christ, you can consummate the marriage with the groom as often as you like. God leaves it to you to enter into that marriage with the Son, Jesus Christ, the groom, where we become one spirit with Christ. We are at the Lord's table. We are sharing in the Lord's Supper. And a portion is apportioned to us and spoken out of our individual organs of speech. A portion of what is set at the Lord's table is put in front of us and spoken through our organs of speech. This is God's salvation plan. And when we say we lay down our soul and we take it back again, that is illustrating the punctiliar nature of the end purpose of God's salvation plan. That just means it has a beginning and an end. And we choose when to lay down our soul. We choose when to take it back again. Jesus is saying it right here in verse 17. It's repetitive, church. Just like the Lord's Supper is repetitive. Just like consummating the marriage with the groom. We're the bride, consummating the marriage with the groom. We come to the groom and consummate the marriage with him repetitively, not one time. As often as we will come to him, the marriage is consummated. We're at the Lord's table. We're sharing in the Lord's Supper. But it requires a sharing in his suffering. We have to die to self. We have to remove our sin-infected mind from the process. Jesus said to Simon Peter, when Simon Peter acknowledged that he was the Messiah and the Son of the living God, and Jesus said to Peter, Simon Bar-Jonah, you wouldn't know this except my Father in heaven revealed it to you. And on this rock being the revelation of who I am in your heart, Simon Peter, on this rock I will build my church. And I will build my church. I will convert the lost out of the house of the ruler of this world and into the house of God. I will build my church. And the gates of Hades will not come against it. Because why? Because we have to lay down ourselves. We have to get our sin-infected mind out of the way. That's the gates of Hades. It's a hard thing for a lot of people to come to reckon with, that the mind that they think with, that I think with, this is the gates of Hades. My sin-infected mind is the gate to Hades. And Jesus says that my sin-infected mind will not come against his work to build the kingdom, because I get my mind out of the way, and the mind of Christ comes and becomes the power operating and working through my flesh, with my mind removed from the process where my organs of speech are releasing the righteousness of God into the world. And those unknowable utterances, those spirit-enabled prayers of unknowable utterances that are released into the world by the cooperative working, where I climb onto the altar, the brazen altar, and become a sacrifice, living, holy, and well-pleasing to God, which is my spiritually spoken service of worship. Romans 12:1. I lay down my soul and enter into that realm of spiritually spoken worship, and I take back my soul when that stops. Jesus says it right here in John 10:17. I lay down my soul and I take it back again. He is speaking as an example for his disciples in the looming age of the new covenant. When he says this, he's looking forward to when you and I will do the same thing. We will become the kalos, good shepherd. We will lay down our soul for the sheep. We will become the ones who are concerned for the sheep because they are our own. How? Because we are the ones who are speaking out, calling out to the sheep by name. And we are leading them out and driving them out of the house of the ruler of this world and bringing them in, driving them into the house of God. Wherefore the Father, agape, loves us. The Father, through the Son Jesus Christ, by the working of the Holy Spirit, through our flesh as instruments of righteousness, the Father is creating. He's creating children of God. He's creating strong children of God who will lay down their souls for the sheep and take it back again. And then lay it down again and take it back again, and do this repetitively, do this frequently, lay down our soul and take it back again. Remember in the first passage where Jesus talked about going in and out. I want you to see these things, church. Let me find this, Robin. It's in the second passage. Started there at verse 7. I want you to see this, church. I want you to see these things. We don't make these things up at Legacy Bible Church, but they're reinforced and reiterated over and over and over in the New Testament. If you know what you're reading and you're relating it properly to the full salvation plan of God. So let me just read verse 7. Therefore Jesus said again, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers. He's talking to Pharisees here. Yet the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door, says Jesus. If ever anyone might enter through me, he will be saved. That's the realm of salvation, the end purpose of God's salvation plan. And he will come in. This is verse 9 here, part B of verse 9. He will be saved. And he will come in, and he will go out, and he will find pasture. Okay? That's the same punctiliar nature as verse 10:17 later when Jesus said, I lay down my soul and I take it back again. He will go in and he will go out and he will find pasture. He will lay down his soul and he will take it back again. He will lay down his soul and go in, and he will take it back again and go out. And then he will find pasture. What is that? That's the edification. That's the creative work God continues to do in us through the Son Jesus Christ to reorder our thinking and to strengthen our faith. That's the pasture that we find when we take our soul back again and we go out and we find pasture. That pasture is the edification from the Lord. I want you to see these connections. So in verse 17, when Jesus is pointing to that iterative nature, that punctiliar nature of the end purpose of God, when he says, I lay down my soul and I take it back again, he's already done that earlier in verse 9, when he said, the good shepherd will go in through the door, Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the door. By the way, Jesus Christ is the only door into the kingdom of heaven. And the good shepherd will go in and will come out, and go in and come out. The good shepherd will lay down his soul on behalf of the sheep and will take it back again. Will lay down his soul on behalf of the sheep and will take it back again. See how this all works together and all fits together, church. So, Robin, if you can go to that last passage again that starts at verse 15. Go right to verse 17, church. On account of this, my Father agape loves me. Father's doing creative working through me and in me. Father agape loves me because I lay down my soul so that I may take it back again. Verse 18, no one takes it away from me. This is the disciples here in the New Covenant age. No one forces us to do this, church. Verse 18, no one takes it away from me, but rather I lay it down from my own will, says Jesus. For our example in this age of the new covenant, no one is going to force you to speak in tongues, church. Don't stand there and say, as I've heard often, maybe not often, but I've heard some important leaders in the church say that I've asked the Father, if you want me to speak in tongues, I will, Lord. And they say, I don't speak in tongues, so he must not want me to. Bad tradition and bad teaching. They simply don't understand the salvation plan of God, the end purpose of God's salvation plan. Where here, Jesus reinforces that it's not God taking away our will. We have to enter into the obedience from faith by our own will. We enter in and we come out. We lay down our soul and we take it back again. This is us doing the sacrificing. And we do that, church. That is manifested when we will cooperatively with God use our organs of speech to speak unknowable utterances. God is not there making our tongue and our jaw move. We are doing it in cooperation with God, but our mind is gone from the process and we do not get to understand what those utterances are saying. Except there is an exception, except as God might give interpretation. And we can know about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Okay, verse 18, worth repeating. No one takes it away from me, but rather I lay it down from my own will. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it back. Where does that authority come from? That authority comes from the fact that you are a child of God. When you become a child of God, that faith in your heart is your authority. That's your invitation to lay down your soul and enter into that end purpose of God's salvation plan. That is your invitation to come to the wedding feast. Remember that parable of the wedding feast? And I think it's in Matthew, where Jesus said, the king is throwing a wedding feast, and he sent out invitations, and all of the locals said, well, I'm too busy, I got too much going on. So Jesus said, okay, go beyond the locals, go onto the roads and the highways and the byways, and start inviting people until my wedding hall is filled up. This is the wedding feast here. And the authority to participate, the authority to come to the wedding feast, the Lord's Supper, the consummation of the wedding between the bride and the groom, the authority is faith. You can see that in chapter 1, where, I don't have it here with me, in chapter 1, I think it's verse 12, look right around chapter 1, verse 12, where the fourth evangelist is narrating in his prologue, in his introduction, and he said, to all those who would receive it, what? Faith. To all those who would receive him, he gave authority to become the children of God. That's all the way back in chapter 1. And here again, Jesus is saying that I have authority out of the faith given to me, authority from God. And that's tantamount to an invitation, authority. I have authority to come to the table of the Lord. I have authority to consummate the marriage with the Son, Jesus Christ. I have authority to enter through the door, Jesus Christ, into the kingdom of God. I have authority to enter and to leave. I have authority to lay down my soul and take it back again, not by anybody coercing me to do it. Jesus said here, I do it of my own will. And so also us, church, as disciples of the Lord, we have authority to enter the kingdom and to come out again. We have authority to lay down our soul and to take it back again. Authority because God has sovereignly made us his children. That gives us authority to enter into the inheritance. That's the inheritance. You know, Jesus talks about that. Some of the letters talk about the inheritance. The inheritance is that punctiliar season when we are in the kingdom of God, when we are God's instruments of righteousness, bringing his salvation into the world. That's the inheritance. That's the fulfillment of the promises of God, that end purpose of God's salvation plan. When the ruler of this world is being judged and his house is being plundered and the house of God is being increased. That's the promises of God. And Jesus finishes by saying, in the end of verse 18, I received this command from alongside my Father. And church, this goes all the way back to the garden, when God said to Adam, do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Do not eat from that tree of self-righteousness. Eat, the inference being, the message being, eat only from the tree of life. That's your source of righteousness. Do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Jesus is reflecting that here in these final words. I received this command from alongside my Father. Eat from the tree of life. Lay down my soul for the sheep. Speaking the will of the Father. That's the tree of life. That's the commandment of God that goes all the way back to the beginning. Paul calls it the righteous requirement of God in Romans 1:32, if you want to go look at that. That's the righteous requirement of God that Jesus, what Paul referred to in Romans 1:32, same thing that Jesus is referring to here at the end of verse 18. I received this command from alongside my Father. This last passage I'm going to finish with today is a narrative passage. The fourth evangelist is narrating it as he transitions to the next passage, which begins at verse 22. So, Robin, bring up verse 19. I titled that Schism Among the Leaders. The leaders what? The leaders of the Jews. Verse 19. Again, because this has already been referenced several times before, I think beginning in chapter 7, he references a schism that happened based on what Jesus was teaching. Again, there came to be a schism among the Jews. Right? He's teaching, or he's speaking to the Pharisees here. The Jews being the leaders of the Jews. When the fourth evangelist refers to the Jews broadly, he's almost always referring specifically to the leaders of the people of God, according to the flesh, the leaders of the Jewish people. When he says the Jews, he's referring to leaders. Again, there came to be a schism among the Jews on account of these logos words. And many of them were saying, he has a demon and he rages. Why do you listen to him? Others were saying, these Rhema words are not from someone being demonized. A demon is not able to open the eyes of the blind, is he? And that goes all the way back to the beginning of chapter 9 when Jesus healed the blind man. A demon is not able to open the eyes of the blind, is it? So Jesus is causing division, and I want you to see the distinction here in words. You notice here that in verse 19, the author, this is the fourth evangelist, John the elder, is writing here. These are not Jesus' words speaking. He's writing at the end of the first century. Again, there came to be a schism among the Jews on account of these logos words. And then in verse 21, he says, others were saying, these Rhema words are not from someone being demonized. A demon is not able to open the eyes of the blind, is it? So at the end of the first century, these are logos words. The fourth evangelist is narrating, saying they're logos words at the end of the first century when he wrote. But those that are on Jesus' side in this schism are calling them Rhema words back in AD 33 when late AD 32 when they were spoken. Some of the Pharisees that were moving toward Jesus recognize that Jesus is speaking prophetically here. Jesus is speaking about something that is going to happen that maybe hasn't fully happened yet. They recognize, those that are moving toward Jesus are recognizing that this is a prophet speaking. And so they call these Rhema words. But at the end of the first century, the fourth evangelist calls them Logos words. They're fulfilled. they've become reality. The creative working of God through the words of Jesus back in AD 32, which were prophetic Rhema words, have become fulfilled Logos words by the end of the first century, at the time that the author of the fourth evangelist, or the fourth gospel, is writing. Now, sadly, you won't see that in your English translations that translate. You look at it in verse 119, your English translation is going to say words. And in verse 121, again, they're going to say these words were not from one demonized. They're not going to distinguish between Logos words and Rhema words. But I do in Stauros, the Wooden Bible. I do distinguish between Logos words and Rhema words. Robin, let them see that. Bring up that passage there beginning at verse 19. I want you to see this. This is an example of an unparaphrased translation. When an English translation translates Logos and Rhema both with the same gloss word, they are paraphrasing. That is an act of paraphrasing. The only way to stay out of that dangerous realm of paraphrasing is to distinguish those two words. And I do that by transliterating Logos with the first use there in verse 19, where you see Logos in italics, Logos words. And then in verse 21, italicizing Rhema, the transliteration of the word Rhema words. And so they're distinguished. And so you can know that this is part of the rhetorical argument of the author here, is to distinguish what he is doing. Remember, he's writing typologically with a secondary level of meaning into the second century, or into the end of the first century, with writing accurately the biographical history of Jesus. I want you to see right here in this passage that you see evidence of that two levels of writing it with a secondary meaning, pointing toward the ecclesial controversy at the end of the first century, which is why he uses Logos words, with a primary level of meaning, the historical biography of Jesus Christ, where here he has those Pharisees that are moving toward Jesus, referring to his words as prophetic Rhema words. You can see the author's two levels of writing here. Writing at the level of Jesus first century milieu, Jesus milieu in AD 30 to AD 33 with the cross, and writing late in the first century with this milieu, this controversy that is still brewing and in fact growing between the church at Rome and the churches of Asia and the respective Christian traditions represented by both respectively. You see this here, the way the author uses Logos words and Rhema words. I know that may be a hard concept to grasp for some of you, but you have to, as I say often, you have to hear it somewhere for the first time. So this is the level of teaching we bring to you at Legacy Bible Church. It's hard to understand, but as the fog begins to lift on the fullness of God's salvation plan, these things become a lot easier to understand. But you have to do the hard work here in the beginning of listening closely, contemplating deeply about these things that are being represented in these passages that are just pregnant with meaning and are representing God's two-dimensional plan of salvation. So that's going to complete the 5-part series on the Good Shepherd. Gosh, what can you say other than these passages are so full, so pregnant with meaning that I know that I could probably do another 2-3 weeks and just go in deeper, reinforcing reviewing, but we're going to leave it at that. 5-part series. I'm going to move into the second half of chapter 10, and that takes us several months ahead. You recall that from chapter 7 all the way through this pericope on the Good Shepherd, Jesus has been in the context of the Feast of Booths in late September, early October of AD 32. Now with the second half of chapter 10, we move into the feast, what the author calls the Feast of Dedication. That's Hanukkah. That's in December, late December of AD 32. So you get a jump of about 2 months here from the beginning of chapter 10 to this second half of chapter 10 that I'm going to start on next week. The feast, pardon?
Go ahead.
The Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah. And so your assignment for this week is, if you have it in you, go back and listen to review the teachings on the Good Shepherd and do a little bit of research. It won't take a lot. It really won't take a lot, but do a little bit of research on what is Hanukkah? What is the Feast of Dedication? Of course, we're going to talk about it, but that'll be a good assignment to kind of set you up for the beginning of the discussion on the second half of chapter 10.
And the verses are going to be put up that you did through this whole series.
Yeah.
Verses are put up this week.
Okay, good. Robin is going to share the verses from the Good Shepherd with you here so you can do some screenshots for your own review. So God bless you. We'll be with Sarah on Wednesday for another chat time. And Sunday, God willing, we'll be with Sarah. And then Sunday, we'll be with you for the first teaching on the second half of chapter 10, the Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah. So God bless you, church.